Welcome back again, lecture number 7 for the reproductive system. We're going to get into the hormonal regulation of male reproduction. And now, of course, when we get over to the female reproductive side, hormonal regulation is much more complex than it is in a male because hormones have to control both the development of the oocytes, the egg cells in the female, and then also the changes that occur along the endometrium, the inside lining of the uterus each month. So hormones are controlling multiple processes there. In the male, it's not quite as complex, but we are going to go through the different aspects of hormonal regulation of sperm development. Okay, so in both males and females, there are a series of hormones that are involved in production of the gametes, sperm or egg cells, and this is controlled through a hypothalamic, pituitary, gonadal, or HPG axis. So if you think way back to the beginning of the semester when we were covering the endocrine system, of course we learned that the hypothalamus is the master of the master and secretes a number of releasing hormones that travel that short distance through blood vessels to the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary gland. They stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to secrete hormones that then travel to other parts of the body and affect their targets, wherever those may be. Differs for different hormones. So in the case of the hormones that we're talking about here for the reproductive system, those targets are going to be the gonads, the testes in the male, and the ovaries in the female. So we're going to see how all this works. And in the male, here are hormones that are going to be involved. So GnRH is gonadotropin releasing hormone, which we heard about way back at the beginning of the semester. So that's secreted by the hypothalamus. That's one of those releasing hormones. And then it travels to the anterior pituitary. And you may remember that the anterior pituitary secretes FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and LH stands for luteinizing hormone. And both of these are going to be involved in sperm production in males and controlling egg development and the changes along the endometrium of the uterus in females. Okay, these hormones lead to, in the testes, production of testosterone, the primary male sex hormone, and then another one called inhibin. And of course, testosterone has widespread effects on the male body, not just in the testes. Inhibin is a hormone that plays a role in negative feedback, so it's going to travel. Both of those hormones are going to affect the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary negatively and shut down or reduce the production of these other hormones through a typical negative feedback type mechanism like we saw earlier in the semester. All right, the next several slides are come straight out of your textbook, and they're just going to animate this for you. So up here we have our, oops, hang on, keep forgetting to leave my pen on here. Up here we have the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, so that should look pretty familiar to you. And then down in here we are in the wall of a seminiferous tubule, and outside that wall over here we have those interstitial endocrine cells. Those are the cells that are located in the spaces between the seminiferous tubules and the testes. All right, so as I just was mentioning on the previous slide, the hypothalamus secretes GnRH, that's a gonadotropin releasing hormone. We learned about that back at the beginning of the semester. That hormone travels through the portal blood vessels that extend between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. And it stimulates, there are cells in the anterior pituitary that produce follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So GnRH stimulates secretion of those two hormones. Those hormones travel through the blood. Their targets are going to be in the testes in a male. Okay, so here's what FSH is doing. The target for FSH is actually, if you notice really carefully here on the slide, the sustenanocytes. They're the targets of FSH. Okay, and FSH stimulates those sustenanocytes to secrete ABP. And ABP stands for androgen, can't spell today, androgen binding protein. Okay, so that name's going to provide us with a little bit of a hint about what ABP is going to do. ABP binds androgens, testosterone. Androgens are male sex hormones. Testosterone is a male sex hormone. And so ABP is a protein that localizes within the walls of the seminiferous tubules, and it's going to wind up binding or concentrating testosterone down within the walls of those tubules. And by doing that, it's going to stimulate spermatogenesis. Okay, then how about our LH? If you look here, the targets of LH are the interstitial cells, or the interstitial endocrine cells, as your textbook is calling them. And it stimulates those to secrete testosterone. All right, so testosterone is going to, some of it's going to stay here locally in the testes. And the reason that's going to happen is because these ABP proteins, androgen binding proteins, that are there within the walls of the seminiferous tubules are going to capture the testosterone and keep it concentrated down in that area. Just dropped my stylus. But lots of testosterone will also enter the blood vessels that are located in the testes and will be carried around throughout the body. And that testosterone will have widespread effects on the male body and lead to the development and the preservation of the male gender characteristics that we're familiar with. Okay, and that's what this part of the diagram is highlighting for us. Testosterone gets captured by the ABP, concentrated, and notice that is stimulating spermatogenesis. So one of the major effects of testosterone in the testes is to increase spermatogenesis. So you're going to stimulate these cells to undergo meiosis, and then you're going to stimulate the development of those spermatids into spermatozoa, or fully developed sperm. And then over here, the testosterone gets into the bloodstream and has somatic. So somatic is referring to tissues of the body, and psychological effects as well in the brain. And very important, plays a very important role with maintenance of secondary sex characteristics. So throughout the semester we've talked about gender differences between males and females, such as the greater cardiac output in males, the greater inspiratory reserve volume in males versus females. In Biology 201 you learned about the higher bone density, the greater muscle mass that develops on average in males versus females. Remember, anatomy is always an average, so these things are not absolutes, but those, all those different characteristics, testosterone plays a very important role in their development. Increased red blood cell production in the bone marrow, we talked about that at the beginning of the semester as well. Okay, another thing that testosterone does is it has negative feedback. So that's what this part of the diagram is highlighting for you here, this dashed line. Testosterone has negative feedback on the anterior pituitary, and so it's going to decrease production of FSH and LH. That winds up being an issue very often for people who take testosterone supplements, or you have bodybuilders who are taking chemical molecules that resemble testosterone, because when you do that, you're taking those steroid supplements to try to jack up your muscle mass. But guess what it's doing to some forms of those drugs decrease your FSH and your LH production. So guess what that does to your spermatogenesis? Now, offhand, you might think, well, it's not going to have any impact because you need testosterone over here for spermatogenesis. And that's true, you do need it. But the other thing that you need this ABP over here. Those sustenacular cells in the walls of the seminiferous tubules have to produce ABP to capture this testosterone and keep it locally concentrated within the walls of those seminiferous tubules where sperm cells are forming. So guess what? If you don't have this, if you don't have FSH being secreted by your anterior pituitary, then you ain't going to have the ABP being produced in the walls of your seminiferous tubules. So taking, large amounts of these testosterone supplements to try to increase your muscle mass can have a negative effect on sperm cell production. And also, if your sperm cell production is inhibited, guess what? The walls of those seminiferous tubules shrivel up. They atrophy because you don't have as many cells in there undergoing mitosis and meiosis for sperm cell production. And so you may have heard before about bodybuilders who are taking testosterone supplements and their testes basically shrinking and shriveling up, and that really does happen in some cases where you're taking those enhancers. Another aspect of negative feedback, so testosterone has negative feedback on FSH and LH secretion, and so does inhibin. Inhibin is produced by the sustenacular cells. And it goes into the blood, travels up here to the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus, and has negative feedback on the secretion of those hormones. Okay, let's see. I think this slide just has written for you some of the information that I just went over, so I'm not going to read that back to you. This slide, the second one, is just illustrating for you again some of the roles of testosterone. Many roles in the male sex organ maturation. You don't have sperm cell production unless you have testosterone around, important for the development and maintenance of all those secondary sex characteristics. The ones that I mentioned, body hair development, things like that, those are all secondary sex characteristics. Testosterone is also important for libido, sex drive as well. Higher testosterone levels typically lead to higher sex drive. Okay, and again, testosterone has negative feedback on the hypothalamus, which inhibits GnRH production, and it also has negative feedback on the anterior pituitary, which inhibits FSH and LH release. And inhibin, which is made by those sustenacular cells, also inhibits GnRH and FSH release. Notice, when is inhibin secreted? It's actually secreted when the sperm count is high. So the sustenacular cells they have some sort of sensory mechanism for determining that there are plenty of sperm cells within the walls of the seminiferous tubules, and when that happens, they start secreting the inhibin, and that lowers the production of FSH and LH up in the anterior pituitary, and therefore that will decrease or slow down the number of sperm that are developing in the seminiferous tubules. All right, so when these processes start at puberty in a male, it takes about 3 years in a male to achieve balance, and then from that point forward, testosterone and sperm cell production are pretty stable throughout a man's life. Of course, they're going to start to decrease when he gets really old, but you guys know there are men in their 80s and even older who have fathered children. If you don't have GnRH, and you don't have the gonadotropins. If you guys remember, tropic hormones or tropins are ones that act on other endocrine glands. So FSH and LH, their targets are the testes, which are endocrine glands. So they're called gonadotropins. And if you're not producing those for any reason, the testes will atrophy because you're not going to have spermatogenesis going on. So there simply aren't going to be as many cells in there bulking up the interior of the testes. And also, without production of LH, testosterone production will go down. You need LH to tell those interstitial cells to secrete testosterone. So if you did have a problem with your anterior pituitary and you weren't secreting FSH and LH, you can imagine what some of the signs and symptoms might be in the male, because there's going to be a reduction in secondary sex characteristics if the male is not producing testosterone properly. All right, we took a look at some diagrams like this at the very beginning of the semester when we talked about steroid-type hormones. Steroid-type hormones are hydrophobic, which means they can diffuse across cell membranes because they don't mind the hydrophobic portions of the plasma membrane of a cell. There's what cholesterol looks like. That's an organic chemistry diagram, and in the future, if you guys take chemistry classes, you'll learn when you see these ring-shaped chemical structures like this, where you see these points, they're not drawing them in, but there are carbons at each of those points, and those carbons also have hydrogens attached to them. And just to keep these organic chemical diagrams more simplified, your organic chemists don't always draw in all the carbons and the hydrogens. It makes it easier to view. They're just understood to be there. But that's what cholesterol looks like, and then over here you can see this is what testosterone looks like. So the core of testosterone looks like the core of a cholesterol molecule, but there are some changes. Enzymes inside the cells that produce testosterone convert cholesterol into the testosterone molecule. And on this diagram, the part in red there is showing you which parts are still identical to the original cholesterol molecule. Testosterone, when it leaves the testes, it actually gets transformed in other tissues, and much of it gets converted to dihydrotestosterone. So it's slightly modified. A couple of extra hydrogen atoms are added to it, and that's the form that it acts on the prostate gland. So prostate function, proper can't talk today, proper prostate function is dependent on these DHT versions of testosterone. And then interestingly, some testosterone goes to the brain, and there it gets converted into estradiol. That's the main type of estrogen, female sex hormone, in the brain. So in the brains of males, some testosterone actually gets converted over to estradiol because there are neurons need estradiol to perform some of their functions properly. So testosterone and estradiol, a type of estrogen, they're very similar chemically if you look at their chemical structures. Okay, mechanisms and effects of testosterone activity. I think we've probably covered almost all of these, because I've already mentioned the multiple anabolic effects throughout the body, like stimulating skeletal muscle growth, bone growth, the different features of the skeletal system, other body systems, has impact on hematopoiesis in the red bone marrow. Anything you can think of that's a male characteristic is generally influenced by testosterone. Also targets all the accessory sex organs. Right, so their function and proper development is dependent on testosterone. The changes in the male reproductive anatomy that occur at puberty are stimulated by testosterone. And as I've already mentioned, a testosterone deficiency is going to lead to the atrophy of the various male sexual organs, both primary and secondary. So even things like semen volume will decline. There will be erectile dysfunction, and ejaculation is impaired as well if you're not synthesizing testosterone properly. Yes, we do have testosterone replacement therapies that can be given to males who are having problems producing their own testosterone. And actually, we're starting to hear about those on commercials a lot more. We've heard about women taking estrogen replacement therapy for a number of years, and now it's becoming more common for males to take testosterone replacement therapy when they hit middle age or older as well. You've probably seen those commercials on TV. It's actually delivered in a like a roll-on deodorant type application. Okay, this slide is, I think I've covered a lot of this already. Secondary sex characteristics of males that are under the influence of testosterone. And so you guys know appearance of pubic, axillary, facial hair begins to occur at puberty in a male, and so that's when testosterone levels increase greatly. Chest hair deepening of the voice, that's due to the lengthening of the vocal cords in the larynx and them becoming larger than they are in a female. Thicker skin, higher oil production, sebum production is common in males versus females. The increased bone density, skeletal muscle mass that we've talked about, the basal metabolic rate, your BMR, typically, how fast you bust through calories, burn through calories to generate ATP for energy, typically higher in a male than a female. And then testosterone influences libido as well. All right, so that's actually going to, now that we've covered the hormones and talked about some of the effects of testosterone, that actually wraps up the male side of the reproductive system. As you might imagine, the female side of the reproductive system is a little bit more complex, especially with regard to the hormonal control. And so we'll have several more lectures on the female side than we did over on the male side. In lecture number 8, we'll have our introduction to the female reproductive system.